The place was Tulsa, Oklahoma, and 19-year-old Dick Rowland had dropped out of school and had started shining shoes at a local pool hall on 3rd and Main. Shoe shines cost a dime, but a good shoe shine could make upwards of $10 a day. Dick Rowland had a outgoing personality, well suited for a job in personal service. He wore nice suits, had a large amount of cash, and wore a diamond ring that earned him the nickname Diamond Dick. May 31st, 1921. On this day, Rowland was on his way to the Drexel building, which was mostly closed for the Memorial Day holiday. But the building had something that very few buildings downtown had, and that was a colored restroom on the top floor. As Rowland entered the elevator, it was being operated by a white 70-year-old woman by the name of Sarah Page. Welcome, I'm Country Boy, and this is One Mic Black History. As you may know, this is the second part of my series on the Tulsa Massacre, and today we're going to talk about the spark that led to the massacre itself. As usual, you can find me at onemichistory.com, where you can check out all my old episodes. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so at my Patreon page or my Buy Me Coffee, which is linked down in the show notes below. Also, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. And without further ado, let's get started. After Dick Rowland entered the elevator, at some point, Sarah Page would scream, and the front desk clerk of the Drexel building would rush over as he saw Dick Rowland fleeing. The clerk would then call the police. Now, the exact details of what happened in that elevator are unknown, but has been the source of constant speculation. Some say that she was a prostitute and he was her pimp. Others say they were lovers, but the most widely accepted version is that the two were simply strangers and that Rowland had tripped and grabbed her arm for balance. Whatever happened in that elevator, what is known is that the police were notified of Rowland's attempt to sexually assault Page, and at least initially, the police seemed very skeptical. They could have launched a manhunt or a dragnet or an urgent command, but they didn't. In 1946, the police commissioner at the time, James Atkinson, stated that he requested that they conduct a quiet investigation, but common sense alone should have cast doubt on the rape claim. Only a black man with a death wish would try to rape a white woman in broad daylight inside an office building on a major thoroughfare in a bustling city. But this was still Tulsa in 1921, and the simple idea of a black man attempting to rape a white woman, no matter the evidence, would trigger an immediate reaction. By the end of the day, the city had started to get word of the incident and feared issues. So 2 police officers, Henry Pack, who was black, and Henry Carmichael, who was white, was sent to arrest Dick Rowland. The arrest served 2 roles. It served to show that they were serious about the investigation, and 2, it was to protect him from reprisals. As word got around town, the Tulsa Tribune released the first edition with the headline that "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." The Tribune took an almost random encounter and mixed it with racism and fear. Rowland's guilt or innocence was beyond the point. He had admitted to touching the girl, and the headline presumed his guilt. The article had Tulsa buzzing, and talk of a lynching had spread like wildfire. The police chief, John Gustafson, moved Rowland from the city jail to the county jail on 6th, which was more secure because it had the jail on the top floor of the courthouse. By 3:30, Gustafson had received a call stating that the Negro was going to be lynched. Now, the Tribune didn't explicitly mention lynching, but years later, African Americans in Tulsa would claim that they read an editorial with the headline that read, "To lynch a Negro tonight." Now, it's possible that this article did exist in 1921 and had since gone defunct. While newspapers were preserved on microfilm, Anything from May 31st has been removed, with the Tribune's headline being "The Lone Survivor." Either way, the Tribune's headline was more than enough to light the already short fuse. By 4 o'clock, Tulsa had a dangerous combination of forces of a black man in jail, a newspaper making irresponsible claims, a city with a history of mob justice, and a city of African Americans who had been attempting to assert their political rights. The police commissioner had advised the sheriff, Willard McCullough, who was not the sheriff at the time, that Roy Belton was lynched by the mob only 9 months earlier, to take Rowland out of town, but he would completely refuse. As Tulsans made their way home, they read the Tribune, and white crowd began to gather outside the courthouse. 3 men attempted to enter the building and demanded Dick Rowland, but they only spoke to the sheriff. He stated that there has been talk of a lynching, but you might as well go because no one is going to get to this Negro. And with that, the men simply left. Unknown to the crowd, the case against Dick Rowland was beginning to crumble. Sarah Page was being questioned at the police station, and she had decided that she was not going to press charges. The police had other concerns other than his guilt or innocence, because none of that mattered to the mob that gathered out in front of the courthouse. They were far more concerned with keeping the mob at bay. The sheriff had instructed his deputies to disable the only elevator and stationed them behind the door of the narrow staircase, which was the only way in or out. Gustafson would make a few trips to the courthouse between 7:30 and 9 p.m. It seemed that the angry white mob had diminished and only left a group of curiosity seekers. It appeared that the worst was over, and what they didn't expect was a very active African American community of Greenwood. The news from the Tribune and the possibility of a lynching had galvanized the community of Greenwood. The community had decided that no black man was going to be lynched tonight, not on their watch. The blacks of Greenwood refused to submit to another violation of their spirit, and I.H. Spears, a black lawyer in Greenwood, would later state that every time I heard of a lynching, it made me want to go buy more ammunition. The general consensus is that the lynching would be stopped. Arguments arose over exactly how they were going to go about doing that, and whether or not they could trust the police. The younger, more militant African Americans wanted to round up weapons and ammunition and prep for a battle, while the older African Americans equally wanted to avert a lynching, but sought to also avert a destructive confrontation that would cost them the most. O.W. Gurley learned of a possible lynching around 4 o'clock that day and walked to the courthouse and spoke to the sheriff. The sheriff assured Gurley that there wouldn't be no lynching as long as he was the sheriff. And if you keep your folks away from here, there won't be any trouble. With Gurley's attempt to explain that to the group, the more militant African Americans called him a liar and stated that if they took that white man out of the jail just a few months ago, they were going to take this nigger out too. Gurley continued to appeal to the crowd, and it worked, and the crowd dispersed. But around 6:30 that night, another meeting convened with J.B. Stratford and another man by the name of A.J. Smitherson, two of the strongest and wealthiest members of the African American community in Greenwood. They wanted to do whatever it takes to prevent a lynching, but they also had a lot to lose. Stratford instructed the group that they should only go to the courthouse if Rowland's life was in danger or that the sheriff called them to help. They didn't want violence to spiral out of control and realized that they had a thin margin of error. Around 7:30, about 30 African Americans, some carrying weapons, walked towards the courthouse. Willard McCullough asked his black deputy sheriff, Barney Cleaver, to handle the group. The group stated that they were coming to see about a lynching, and Cleaver told him that the boy was locked up upstairs and to go home. The group left without incident, but groups of whites stayed at the courthouse, and as the crowd got larger and larger, the rumors of a lynching persisted, and the false report circulated that a mob of whites had stormed the courthouse. By 9:15, a group of 25 black men arrived at the courthouse again. Unlike the earlier incident that day, the one that occurred, they came up with cars and guns, a move that shocked the crowd of whites. Shockingly enough, there were only 5 policemen that were on duty in the area at the time. And as they walked up to the courthouse, McCullough stood on top and told them to go home unless they wanted to get a lot of people hurt. And they had no business parading around with guns like that. One of the black men told him that we'll go home when that Negro boy that you want to lynch is let go. McCullough told the group that there was going to be no lynching. And he said that he wasn't even going to be charged. And the girl that had admitted that he didn't harm her. McCullough explained to the group that he couldn't release Rowland to an angry mob or the angry group of black citizens. So the group once again decided to leave. And it was at this moment that events turned from watching and participating in a lynching to now the white mob felt that they needed to protect themselves against a potential black onslaught. The armed group of blacks had already come into their part of town, and if they came back, the whites wanted to be ready and fully prepared. Some of the mob went home and others went to the National Guard Armory. Around 9 p.m., Major James Bell of the 108th Infantry called the sheriff and the police. They assured Bell that they could handle any issue that came their way. Bell would tell his commanding officers of the 3 National Guard units at Fort Steele to prepare to leave the next day for Tulsa, and the National Guard members in Tulsa to report to the armory. Not long after that, 400 whites showed up to the armory demanding rifles and ammunition. He explained that the armory was only for guardsmen and ordered them to leave. But the mob rushed the door, and guardsmen armed with loaded rifles told them that they would shoot any person that attempted to enter, and finally the mob withdrew. This was around 10 p.m. when a group of 1,500 white Tulsans convened at an intersection of 6th and Boulder in Tulsa. A larger contingent of about 75 blacks was once again making their way to the courthouse. The black group had heard further reports about whites attempting to storm the courthouse, and they were determined to get Dick Rowland out of the courthouse. Once again, they were confronted by Sheriff McCullough. McCullough told him that Rowland was safe, and he told them to stop parading around with guns, and violence was easy to start but hard to stop. He told them to look at the window on the top floor and that he would cut down anyone that attempts to take this courthouse. Now go home before you get a lot of people shot. As the blacks attempted to back off once again, a white man approached one of the members of the group and said, "Nigger, what are you doing with that pistol? I'm going to use it if I need to." He told the black man, "No, you're going to give it to me." And he simply replied, "Like hell I will." A struggle ensued, a shot was fired in the air, and as the sheriff would explain later, all hell broke loose. The outnumbered group of African Americans scattered down the street and ran in an attempt to reach Greenwood, which was about 7 blocks away, in the midst of a hail of bullets. A few members on both sides lay dead or dying on the ground, and some of the group did reach Greenwood and would use the familiar ground and added reinforcements. But when a growing mob of white Tulsans pursued the fight, it quickly was about to get out of hand. Near the courthouse on 4th Street, an ambulance showed up and attempted to help some of the injured men, but a group of whites ordered the ambulance worker not to touch the black man because he was a nigger looking for trouble, and that they better get going unless they wanted to join him. Naturally, the ambulance simply left. Skirmishes continued downtown as the rest of the black group attempted to race back to Greenwood in a desperate retreat, gone with the earlier bravado because the men were outnumbered and now were being hunted. The white mob turned into rioters, and after being denied guns at the armory, they armed themselves with guns by breaking into sporting goods stores, pawn shops, and hardware stores in downtown Tulsa. Not only did they steal pistols and shotguns and ammunition, but they also stole jewelry and leather goods and clothes, totaling almost $43,000. White Tulsans believed that this was not a riot, but a black insurrection, an invasion of downtown by heathens hell-bent on conquering the peaceful white inhabitants of Tulsa. A rumor had went around in Tulsa that a white messenger boy had gone into Greenwood and beaten and whipped and set free in order to tell them this what happens when white people come into our town. The phrase Negro uprising was often used by National Guard reports. One National Guardsman even referred to African Americans as the enemy. Unlike other riots in which the citizens worked outside or against the law, the police themselves legitimized the riots by deputizing groups of men to patrol the streets between the white and black sections of town. They gave the men police badges, ribbons, guns, and others were commissioned as a special deputy sheriffs. Walter White, the assistant secretary for the NAACP, was one of the men deputized. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed White could easily pass for a white Tulsan and travel throughout the South writing and investigating lynchings, and he arrived in Tulsa just in time to be deputized at City Hall. He was only asked 3 questions: his name, his age, and his address. He would later explain that he could have been a thug or a murderer or an escaped convict, but none of that mattered because my skin was apparently white, and that was enough. After he was deputized, he was told, now go out there and shoot you a nigger because the law is behind you. These special deputies quickly became the most dangerous part of the mob. Shortly before the riot, Governor James B.A. Robertson was told of the unrest and reached out to the police chief and the sheriff, but Gustafson assured him that the situation was under control as to not appear helpless to the governor. After the shooting started, though, he called Major Bell at the armory and asked him to dispatch the local National Guard and clear the streets of Negroes. Lieutenant L.J.F. Rooney was dispatched from the local National Guard and brought men with him to the police station, where he found another 150 in military formation and basically said he took control of the group. The first portion of the riot for white Tulsans was about massing a large enough force to deter any assault from African Americans in Greenwood. The police deputized citizens, and when Major Daly from the National Guard reached the police station at 12:05, he was instructing the white mob to maintain order if they could follow his instructions. He formed patrols of 20 men, each led by a service member, and he told them to gather up Negroes, but only fire to protect life. Even if they wanted to restore order, they did not have the manpower. It was an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 armed white Tulsans running the streets. The only chance they had to restore order is for Oklahoma militia to be sent in large numbers from other parts of the states. But no one wanted to make that call for fear that they would look incompetent or simply out of pride. It wasn't until 1:36 a.m. that Governor Robertson received a telegram about a race riot developing in Tulsa, and that several people had been killed and they were unable to handle the situation. The request that the National Guard be sent by train, and at 12:14 a.m. the governor called the National Guard, and a special train with 100 men left from Oklahoma City to Tulsa by 5 a.m. the following day. Back in Greenwood, the news of a riot spread slowly in the black areas, and many African Americans simply went to bed. Shooting was common within Tulsa, and many blacks thought the blacks venturing in a white Tulsa would bear the brunt of the trouble. There was no Negro invasion. The group from the initial confrontation and those that had survived had escaped back into Greenwood, where they would simply make their stand. It was at this moment that the riot moved from white Tulsa to Greenwood. Shortly after midnight, gunfire erupted along the Frisco track, which was a line of demarcation between the white and black commercial districts, and members of that group defending Greenwood became the stuff of legends that would be passed down for generations of black Tulsans. Even the local guardsmen said that the black Tulsans fought like tigers, but the ferocity couldn't help a huge vulnerability of Greenwood. It was vulnerable to fire. During the Battle of the Frisco Track, several white men threw oily rags inside buildings as they burst into flames, and the wind did the rest of the work. And with that, Tulsa was on fire. Meanwhile, the night was still young in white Tulsa. The anticipation of a race-motivated showdown created a weird, festive atmosphere mixed with alcohol and guns. As the night wore on, the crowds in the street got larger, and with many of them held a gun in one hand and a bottle of alcohol in the other. But without an enemy, they lacked a mission. Around 2 a.m., a large crowd gathered on the corner of 2nd and Lewis, and a white man stood up on his car and stated that we're going in at daylight. They came here looking for trouble by coming into this town with guns and trying to take over. They started trouble, and we'll write a finish that they will never be able to forget. Be ready to go into nigger town. Back in Greenwood, the fire simmered and damage was mostly contained. Although cars full of whites would drive into Greenwood, they would be met with gunfire. And by 2 a.m., the shooting had mostly stopped, and blacks thought the riot was over and that they had actually won. They were about to find out just how wrong they were during the events of June 1st and the invasion of Black Wall Street. In the early morning of June 1st, thousands of armed white Tulsans gathered along the northern edge of Greenwood. Minutes later, a siren would wail and the invasion of Greenwood was on. Thousands of white men poured into Greenwood. A machine gun was even placed on a grain elevator and fired into Greenwood at any black Tulsan that attempted to move. Crowds of people who were there simply to watch or take pictures sat on the northwestern edge of Greenwood. Divided into smaller groups of rioters, they would reach a home or a business, simply shoot the lock off and take any valuables and smash anything that they could break, pile up their bedding, furniture, and clothes, set them outside the residence, and set them on fire. The fires moved along Archer Street, and rows of homes were ignited as rioters started new fires. Telephone poles and power lines were either toppled or also set on fire, and soon all the power in Greenwood had been shut off. As the morning wore on, the buildings on Archer Street disintegrated or were burned out, and new fires were carefully started on the east side of Greenwood as to avoid the white homes on the other side. The police seemed very much intent on helping the mob rather than protecting black lives or property. Later, V.B. Bostic, a black deputy sheriff, would state that a white officer drove him and his wife from their home, poured gasoline on the floor of that home, and set it on fire. Some of the officers even changed their clothes into plain clothes and led groups into Greenwood to loot their homes. In reports after the riot, the chief would state that the people setting fires didn't have on uniforms, but may have had stars or badges on. He stated that the special police knocked down doors and were setting the fires. In court testimony, Gustafson later stated that he didn't implicate any of his officers, but suggested that the special police started the fires, and they were unable to limit the commissions to people of our own choice. They may have lost their head and applied a torch, but he could possibly state that that contradicted the orders that he had given them. While the fire department didn't join in the riot, they relented to the mob. The station was called out at 2 a.m. to man and Archer, and as the firefighters attached a hose to a water plug, several white Tulsans pointed their gun at several of the firefighters. He told them to get away from that hose or they would get killed. As the fires raged in the background, the men disengaged their hose and simply went back to the fire station and went back to sleep. When the next alarm sounded, the fire truck didn't leave. They had orders not to show up. And even the next day, when the fire department attempted to do their job, they were no match for the rioters, who set fires as the firefighters were putting out other fires. The riot overwhelmed the blacks of Greenwood and left them with very few options. Some continued to mount armed resistance, while others contrived to hide anywhere they could, whether it be an outhouse box or a hog pen. Many attempted to escape on foot, but that was a 9-mile walk to Sandy Spring or any nearby community. For anyone who stayed in Greenwood, saving their assets was simply not a possibility. Survival was their best and only option. Men and women ran through Greenwood in their night clothes and bare feet, carrying their children. One woman had a stillborn baby in a shoebox. It was supposed to be buried on June the 1st, but with all that running through Greenwood, she lost the box and desperately searched the ground, screaming, "Where's my baby?" Later testimony would state that she was never able to locate her baby. Even when some African Americans did surrender peacefully, didn't guarantee their survival. A.C. Jackson, who was one of the most prominent surgeons in America and one of the leaders in Greenwood, attempted to surrender to a group of white men, and as Jackson walked out of his house with his hand raised up high, the small mob approached him and two whites fired their gun into Jackson's chest. Then, as they walked away, they shot him in the leg. Jackson would die later that day, and his house was set on fire with gasoline. Any black who resisted or had firearms was deemed a bad nigger and was quickly executed. Not only did they want to kill blacks in mass, but they wanted to break their will and destroy their community. With homes defenseless, they rummaged through their drawers and cabinets and celebrated their good fortune. The black deputy sheriff Barney Cleaver, when he left the courthouse on June 1st, he saw two white women carrying his wife's clothes. He stopped the white women and asked them why they were carrying his wife's clothes, and they simply stated that they had got this from a truckload of looted goods from Greenwood. The rioters would justify their looting because the black wealth that had been amassed, they assumed had been obtained by some illegal underground economy that allowed an inferior race to prosper, and then black success was intolerable and would change the social order of white supremacy. So taking their possessions back put them in their place and tipped the social scales back in their proper alignment. Looting the homes of these uppity blacks was a reason for celebration. At 9:14 a.m., General Charles Barrett from the Oklahoma City National Guard showed up with 190 National Guardsmen from Tulsa. By then, destruction had mostly been done, and they struggled to restore order because it was 10,000 plus rioters in the streets. So General Barrett ordered additional troops from nearby towns. Meanwhile, he allowed the state troops to eat breakfast while homes burned and people died, and delayed the order for martial law. With the state troops' lack of urgency, martial law was not imposed until 11:49 a.m. when the riot was effectively over. National Guardsmen had some of the most intense gun battles with the blacks of Greenwood. Between 8 and 9 a.m., the police requested urgent assistance from 2 units to stop black men from the northwest edge of Greenwood from firing into white homes. 150 Guardsmen showed up with rifles and pistols and were met with immediate firing from the group of blacks. The battle lasted for over 20 minutes, but the group became overwhelmed and began to retreat using buildings of Greenwood as cover. They barricaded themselves into a few homes and refused to stop firing, and eventually were killed by the National Guardsmen. For the blacks of Greenwood, there was no difference between the mob or the National Guardsmen. They were both here to fight the black population. The Mount Zion Church was rumored to be a housing of armaments for the blacks of Greenwood. The rumor was there were 20 caskets had been taken into the church with rifles and ammunitions. Whether or not this was true, the building was sturdy and provided an amazing fortress. Anyone that charged the church was quickly repelled by the gunmen inside. One firefight that morning lasted over an hour. So seeking greater firepower, the white Tulsans called in the local National Guard, and they arrived with a flatbed truck with a heavy machine gun on a tripod. After they showed up, they fired into the church for 5 or 6 minutes till the entire entire building collapsed, and the rest of the building was simply set on fire. The invasion added an added dimension and the element of airplanes flown by whites sweeping over Greenwood in the early morning. The exact reason for their presence was debated, but numerous black witnesses stated that the aircraft was used to assault Greenwoods and the pilots either dropped incendiary devices like turpentine bombs or dynamite or strafed over black victims using their rifles. If these reports are true, Tulsa will be the first city in the United States to be assaulted by aircraft. Walter White wrote, "The 8 planes were employed to spy on the movements of Negroes," and added that some were even used to bomb the colored section of town. But the police would simply state that the planes were used to monitor fires and locate refugees. The blacks in Greenwood final humiliation was the mass exodus of Greenwood. They removed what was left of their homes throughout the rest of the day at gunpoint. The African Americans were lined up in the streets with their hands raised over their head and marched out of Greenwood. Men, women, and children were carrying bundles of their clothes and personal items on their backs or in carts. And with the jail full, the African Americans were detained in the convention hall. Armed guards had to be brought in to keep back the white crowds as Greenwood blacks were brought into the building. Some businesses even gave their white employees the day off because it was nigger day. As the blacks were brought in, they were searched and any weapon was removed. Not every African American came to the hall voluntarily. Some had to be captured, and a man was shot at the door of the convention hall with both his hands raised above his head. When the convention hall was full, the blacks of Greenwood were taken to the heart of the city and taken to the fairgrounds. And by Thursday, June 2nd, 6,000 African Americans had been consolidated at the fairgrounds, and the area that used to groom cows had now been transformed into a sleeping area. As people went to Greenwood to survey the ruins, most of the homes had been destroyed. Electric wires and telephone lines hung in loops on the ground. Office equipment and piles of clothes and household goods lay burned on the ground, and everything had been destroyed except the earth that the buildings were standing on. The ruins of Greenwood were a grim display of racial hatred and prejudice, and the residents of Greenwood had been isolated and mistrust the white residents, and rightfully so. The whites assumed that the blacks were more inclined to violence and could believe that a relatively small population that only represented 12% of Tulsans would attempt to launch an assault on an overwhelming force in White Tulsa. The blacks who drove into the courthouse in White Tulsa were militant, but the White Tulsans assumed that they represented the entire town of Greenwood, and they needed to launch an assault against a Negro uprising before it occurred. Strangely enough, the safest man in Tulsa was Dick Rowland himself, who stayed in the jail under guard all night and was taken out of town in the morning. He never did return to Tulsa, but in late September 1921, the case against Dick Rowland was simply dismissed by the Tulsa County Attorney, received a letter from Sarah Page stating that she would not press charges. In the aftermath, city leaders wanted to get back to business as usual in Tulsa, and even the Tulsa Tribune expressed sympathy for the thousands of colored people whom that were innocent. The sympathy was short-lived. Soon they shifted responsibility for rebuilding Greenwood to the victims themselves. The largest injustice of Greenwood was not the riot itself, but its destruction, and it was carried out not by a white mob, but by the men who led Tulsa and its businesses and political leadership. The wealthiest black men in Greenwood were financially hit the hardest. J.B. Stratford, who was indicted, escaped to Kansas and then Chicago and was never able to recover his fortune. And O.W. Gurley reportedly lost $158,000 in 1921, which would be $2.3 million in today's money. Governor B.A. Robertson had gone to Tulsa during the riots to ensure order. Before returning to the Capitol, he ordered an inquiry into the events of the city and the sheriff's office. He called for a grand jury to be impaneled and an investigation to begin on June 8th. The jury was selected by June 9th, and the judge expected that the state attorney general would call numerous witnesses, both white and black, given the large scale of the riot. The state attorney general, S.P. Freeling, initiated the investigation. Witnesses were heard over 12 days, and in the end, the all-white jury attributed the riot to the black mobs. While noting that police enforcement officials failed to prevent the riot, a total of 27 cases were brought before the court, and the jury indicted more than 85 individuals, but in the end, no one was convicted for the deaths or injury or any of the property damages. After the riot, white Tulsans continued to believe that there would be an invasion by armed Negroes from other cities. City leaders formed a business protective league of 250 men, deployed armed patrols on roads leading into Tulsa, as well as key streets within the city limits. Despite their fears, white Tulsans attempted to try to return back to business as usual, but many of the white Tulsans' routine could not be restored because they heavily relied on blacks for services within their residences. Elite Tulsans had to go back to cooking their own meals and washing their own clothes for the first time in years. The mayor of Tulsa, Mayor Evans, stated that let the blame for this Negro uprising lie right where it belongs, on the armed Negroes and the followers who started trouble and instigated it. Any person who seeks to put half the blame on white people will be wrong and should be told so in not so uncertain terms. On June 3rd, a group of 1,000 business and civic leaders resolving to form a committee to raise funds and rebuild Greenwood. While many black families spent 1921 and 1922 in tents as they worked to rebuild, a group of influential white developers persuaded the city to pass a fire ordinance that will prevent black people from being able to rebuild in Greenwood. The intention was to redevelop Greenwood for more businesses and for industrial use, and to force the black people further to the edge of the city. The case was litigated and appealed to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, where the ordinance was ruled unconstitutional. Most of the promised funds were never raised for black residents, and they struggled to rebuild after the violence. Due to the chaotic nature of the Tulsa Massacre, early tabulations of the dead conflicted wildly, and the number kept reducing. On June 1st, the Tulsa Tribune reported that 9 whites and 68 blacks had died, but the bulletin within the same issue said that 175 were known to be dead. Major Daley of the National Guard would state to the Kansas Star that 175 people were killed, but the next day the Tribune would state that it had only been 30 deaths. On the same day, the New York Times reported that 77 people had been killed, only 5 days later to lower the number to 33 people. In 2001, Oklahoma 1921 Race Massacre Commission report concluded that 36 people, 26 blacks and 10 whites, had died. Today, the Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics officially reported 36 dead. However, the verbal and written accounts from survivors and the Red Cross volunteers and some historians estimate the number to be as high as 300. Even on the lowest estimates, the Tulsa Race Massacre remains one of the deadliest racially inspired riots in United States history. Walter White, the assistant secretary for the NAACP, gave his account of the riot in The Nation magazine. He argued that the riot was caused by whites' envy of black success, the ineffectual law enforcement, and the black radicals' demand for equality. He concluded that between 200 and 250 people had died, with blacks accounting for almost 75 to 80% of those deaths. To add to the indignity, the injustice, General Barrett denied funerals for the deceased. He justified the order on grounds that churches were being used as shelters for the refugees, but only white churches were being used as shelters Jews, and most of the body that needed to be buried were black, which created one of the most controversial issues of the riots. Where did the bodies go? Stories persist that African Americans were stacked up like corkwood on flatbed trucks and driven out of town to be dumped in mass graves or incinerated. It seems to be some truth in the stories because in 2020, researchers did locate unmarked mass graves at the city-owned Oakland Cemetery containing at least 12 coffins from victims from the Tulsa Massacre. It was no mystery, though, about the destruction of Greenwood. The entire 35 blocks of Greenwood's commercial district were completely destroyed, totaling 191 black-owned businesses, several churches, a junior high, and the district's only hospitals was lost. According to the Red Cross, 1,256 homes were burned, with another 215 looted and vandalized. The Tulsa Real Estate Exchange estimated the real estate and personal loss to be at $1.5 million, the equivalent of almost $30 million in 2020. Between June 14, 1921 and June 6 of 1922, Tulsans filed riot-related claims against the city totaling more than $1.8 million, but every single claim was denied. Also, very few insurance claims were paid because most policies excluded riot damage from that coverage. So as a result, the residents sued for damage claims. At the civil trial, witness was brought in by white owner William Redfern, testified that at least some of the law officers and some of the special officers commissioned by the Tulsa Police Department participated in the construction of Greenwood. None, however, could say for certainty that officers had acted under the direction of local authorities. As a result, the courts, including the Oklahoma State Supreme Court, ruled against Redfern and in favor of the insurance company. The decision effectively ended hundreds of lawsuits and damage claims against insurance companies and the city of Tulsa. As a final insult to the massacre came the silence. For decades, Tulsa deliberately ignored and covered up what happened in Greenwood. There were no memorials to the dead, there were no public ceremonies, there was no observation of the anniversary or express regret. Tulsans made no public acknowledgement of the riot. History books didn't even mention the riot at all. Tulsans' response to the riot was called the conspiracy of silence, and the subject of the riot was completely ignored in schools and in newspapers. Efforts to cover up the riot were unmistakable. The biggest example of this was the Tulsa Tribune's decision to shred the editorial pages from that day. And years later, researchers would uncover that police and state militia documents from the riot were also missing. In 1996, at the riot's 75th anniversary, state legislature authorized the Oklahoma Commission to investigate the Tulsa race riot. By appointing individuals to study and prepare a report detailing an historical account of the riot, the commission conducted interviews and heard testimony in order to thoroughly document the causes and damages. The commission delivered its final report on February 21st, 2001. The report recommended substantial restitution for the black residents and listed them below in order of priority. Direct payments be made to survivors of the 1921 Tulsa riot. Direct payments be made to the descendants of the survivors of the Tulsa riot. A scholarship fund be made available to students affected by the Tulsa riot. The establishment of an economic development enterprise zone in the historical district of Greenwood, and a memorial of the reburial of the remains of the victims of the Tulsa race riot. A lawsuit was filed against the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma in 2003, but the federal district and appellate state courts dismissed the lawsuit on the grounds that the state statute of limitation had been exceeded in the 80-year-old case. The state required that civil rights cases be filed within 2 years of the event, and for that reason, the court could not rule on the issues, and the Supreme Court of the United States declined to hear the appeal. There have been renewed calls for compensation to families of the Tulsa Massacre victims. No compensation has ever been paid under court order or by legislation. And lastly, on this day, no person has ever been prosecuted or punished for the devastation and ruin of Greenwood, Oklahoma. Thank you. I'm Country Boy, and this has been One Mic Black History, and this has been my 3-part series on the Tulsa Race Massacre. If you like this, please go to One Mic Black History and listen to my other episodes. Also, you can donate to my Patreon page or my Buy Me Coffee, which is linked below in the show notes. And lastly, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, and peace.